Charlotte Hale sat in the leather chair opposite Alexander Pierce, forcing her body to remain calm even as her pulse raced. Everything about him radiated control, from the perfect lines of his charcoal suit to the measured, icy confidence in his voice. She wasn't negotiating with him. She was pleading, and the truth stung. Her father, Patrick Hale, was facing charges that threatened not only his reputation but also his freedom. A forged signature on a corporate document had spiraled into scandal, and now an impossible bail demand loomed. Alexander Pierce, billionaire head of Pierce Holdings, was offering her a way out. The folder on the table contained his solution, a contract binding her to him for 6 months. In exchange for her presence at his side, living in his penthouse, attending public functions, representing the image of a woman who belonged in his world, he would unleash his legal resources to save her father. The arrangement was brutally simple, written in cold language that left no space for doubt. "Read it carefully," Alexander said, sliding the folder toward her. His voice was deep, smooth, and unhurried, like a man who had no need to rush. Charlotte's eyes scanned the stark clauses. 6 months of loyalty, rules set by him, generous compensation at the end. In return, her father's freedom and reputation restored. "You make this sound so simple," she said, her tone quieter than she intended. "It is simple," he replied, leaning back with the ease of a man accustomed to power. 6 months of your life in exchange for your father's freedom. Live in my penthouse. Follow my rules. You'll be compensated more than fairly. When it ends, you walk away. Clean slate. No one will touch your father again." Her grip tightened around the pen resting beside the folder. The terms stripped away her agency, and his confidence grated against every instinct she had. Yet the weight of her father's future pressed her down like iron. She gathered enough courage to ask, "Why me?" For the first time, his gaze softened, though only slightly. "Because you're different, intelligent, you don't orbit my world the way others do. You'll keep me grounded, and because I always get what I want." His bluntness unnerved her more than his arrogance. Closing her eyes briefly, Charlotte pictured her father behind prison glass, imagined the shame, the collapse of everything her family once stood for. She straightened her spine, opened her eyes, and reached for the pen. 6 months, she said softly, as if repeating it aloud might lessen the weight. Alexander's eyes remained fixed on her as she signed her name at the bottom of the page. He betrayed no reaction, but she felt the shift between them, the contract now a silent wall binding her. When the ink had barely dried, he pulled the folder back, closed it with precise movements, and stood. "Then it's settled," he said. "From this moment on, you belong to me." Her heart thundered. She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't a possession, but the words caught in her throat. She had made her choice, surrendered her freedom for her father's sake. Across the gleaming office, Alexander Pierce's expression remained unreadable, though she thought she caught the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. The contract was signed, and her life had just been rewritten. Charlotte awoke to the quiet hum of the city far below, disoriented for a moment as her eyes adjusted to the pale light spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. The bed was impossibly soft, the linens cool and expensive against her skin. This was not her world. She remembered the pen in her hand, the sharp scratch of her signature, and the words Alexander Pierce had spoken. "From this moment on, you belong to me." The weight of them pressed harder in the silence of his penthouse. Rising, she slipped into a robe provided by the staff and moved toward the glass, staring down at Chicago's skyline. The Art Institute dome gleamed faintly in the distance, the lake a gray shimmer beyond. The city was beautiful, alive, but it felt foreign, like she was standing inside a showcase instead of a home. The scent of coffee reached her before she noticed the open door across the hallway. She followed it to a sunlit kitchen where Alexander was already seated at the long marble island. Sleeves rolled back, reading the Financial Times. He looked up briefly, eyes scanning her without apology, then returned to his paper. "Coffee or tea?" he asked. "Tea," she answered quickly, her voice still thick with morning hesitation. A staff member placed a delicate china cup before her. She lowered herself onto the stool opposite him, acutely aware of the contrast between them. Her hair still damp from the shower, his dark hair immaculate. Her nerves exposed, his composure absolute. Alexander folded the newspaper and set it aside. "There are rules," he said simply. She straightened, bracing herself. You will attend every function I designate. You will dress as my staff directs, but you may adjust details as long as the image remains intact. You will live here in this penthouse and you will not disappear without notice. Privacy is allowed, secrecy is not. When I speak, I expect your discretion. When I need you, I expect your presence. His tone was firm, not unkind, but the authority in it left no room for challenge. Charlotte inhaled slowly. And outside of events? You're free to design, he replied, surprising her. I've seen your work. You're talented. The lobby renovation in the Kensington Hotel was yours, wasn't it? Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, it was. He nodded once, as if confirming his instincts. Good. Pierce Holdings is preparing to redesign the atrium of Pierce Tower. Consider this an audition. Show me what you can do. If you impress me, it becomes your project. The unexpected offer sent a jolt of pride through her chest. She had braced for orders, not opportunity. Why give me that? She asked cautiously. His gaze held hers, calm but unreadable. Because I prefer to invest in competence. And because I want to see how you perform when the stage isn't set for me but for yourself. The words unsettled her, but they stirred something else too. Respect. He stood, gathering his jacket. We leave for the foundation benefit this evening. My assistant will help you prepare. Be ready by 7. As he left the room, Charlotte sipped her tea, heart still unsteady. For all his rules, Alexander had revealed something she hadn't expected. A man who valued ability as much as appearances. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, his control, or the faint glimpse of possibility behind it. By the time Charlotte emerged from the dressing room that evening, the penthouse was quiet except for the low murmur of staff moving discreetly. The gown his assistant had chosen was scarlet silk, cut to flow with elegance rather than excess, its neckline daring but refined. Diamonds shimmered at her ears and her hair had been swept into a graceful twist. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Alexander was waiting near the elevator, dressed in a black tuxedo that sharpened every angle of his tall frame. His eyes lifted as she approached, lingering for a second longer than she expected. A flicker of approval crossed his face before his expression settled back into its usual composure. You clean up well, he said simply, and though the words were clipped, the undercurrent in his voice sent heat rushing to her cheeks. The ride down was silent. The chauffeur waiting with the car. The moment they stepped into the Art Institute's grand entrance, all silence shattered. Flashbulbs flared, voices rose, and a corridor of cameras framed their path. Alexander's hand closed firmly around hers, guiding her forward as though they had done this 100 times before. His grip was steady, grounding her in the chaos. Smile, he murmured. She did, lifting her chin as they glided into the marble atrium. It was a world of glittering gowns, crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of old money. Conversation stopped and turned in their direction, curiosity sparking at the sight of Alexander Pierce with a woman none of them had seen before. Charlotte felt every eye, every unspoken question, but she also felt Alexander's steady presence at her side. When they paused before a group of trustees, he introduced her smoothly. Charlotte Hale, my partner. The word landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples moving outward in every whispered glance. For the next hour, Charlotte found herself swept into a performance. Alexander guided her from group to group, his hand resting lightly at her back, his voice calm as he steered conversations. She spoke when spoken to, offered polite observations, and to her own surprise, she held her own. The nerves that had nearly undone her in his kitchen that morning melted into something steadier. Together, they projected a portrait of elegance and unity. And then she saw Sloane Davenport. The woman moved toward them with calculated grace, her silver gown shimmering under the lights. Her smile was polished, her eyes sharp as glass. Alexander, she purred, leaning in to kiss his cheek. I didn't realize you had company. Charlotte felt Alexander's grip on her waist tighten slightly, subtle but unmistakable. His expression didn't waver. Sloane, this is Charlotte Hale. The two women exchanged smiles that were polite only in appearance. Sloane's eyes flicked over Charlotte, assessing, weighing, dismissing. Interesting choice, she said softly, before turning her attention back to Alexander with feigned sweetness. You'll have to catch me up later. When she moved away, Charlotte's chest tightened. She had expected the stares, the whispers, but not the sting of another woman laying claim to him with such ease. She reminded herself this was an arrangement, nothing more. But her pulse betrayed her, quickening as if it mattered. Alexander leaned down just enough for only her to hear. Ignore her. Tonight you're not my shield. You're my answer. The word struck harder than she anticipated. She swallowed, fighting to maintain her composure. But the faint tremor in her hand gave her away. And for the first time that evening, she sensed that the performance was no longer one-sided. The gala faded into memory by the following week, though Charlotte could still recall the heat of Alexander's words, "You're not my shield, you're my answer." They echoed in her mind whenever she caught his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary, whenever his hand found her waist with effortless certainty in public, whenever she reminded herself that this was supposed to be performance. But performance had its limits, and Alexander Pierce was not a man who tolerated anything less than excellence. Each morning began with the same ritual. Breakfast laid out on the long marble counter. Alexander already seated in pressed shirt sleeves with coffee steaming beside him, and Charlotte with her tea, carefully learning the rhythm of his days. He spoke little during those early hours, but his silence wasn't unkind. It was focused, precise, and disciplined, the kind of energy that filled the air even when no words passed between them. By mid-morning, Charlotte retreated into the work he had given her. The atrium of Pierce Tower was a vast, echoing space in desperate need of transformation, and she attacked it with sketches, mood boards, and long hours bent over architectural plans. She expected him to treat her efforts as a whim, a distraction, but instead, Alexander studied her progress with the same attention he gave to stock reports and board meetings. "You've reimagined the flow of light here," he observed one afternoon, pointing to her rendering of glass panels. "It softens the edges," she explained, her hand steady on the paper. "Pierce Tower is impressive, but it intimidates. People shouldn't feel crushed by stone and glass the moment they enter. They should feel inspired." He regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once. "You're right." The simple affirmation sent a quiet thrill through her chest. Alexander Pierce was not a man who handed out praise lightly, yet he had recognized her vision without hesitation. Their evenings carried a different rhythm. Together they moved through a carousel of events. Foundation dinners, gallery openings, strategy meetings disguised as cocktails. Charlotte learned how to stand at his side, how to smile just enough to deflect intrusive questions, how to listen for what was unsaid as much as what was spoken. The city began to whisper about them, the untouchable billionaire and the mysterious woman who appeared as though she had always belonged. But in private, Charlotte began to notice the edges that others never saw. She saw him remove his cufflinks with quiet precision after midnight, shoulders tense but posture unbroken. She noticed the faintest shadows under his eyes, the way he carried weight no one else dared to acknowledge, and he noticed her too. Not only her beauty on his arm, but the competence in her hands, the certainty in her ideas, the way she challenged him without fear. One night after a particularly grueling benefit, as the car swept them back toward the penthouse, Alexander glanced at her reflection in the window. "You handled Davenport tonight better than I expected," he said. Charlotte lifted a brow. "You doubted me?" "I measure everyone," he replied smoothly. "You exceeded the measure." The compliment was delivered with the same restraint as everything else about him, yet it landed heavily. She looked out at the city lights racing past, fighting the warmth that rose in her chest. This arrangement was supposed to be calculated, detached. But with every day that passed, she felt the lines blurring, and she couldn't ignore the truth. For all his rules and control, Alexander Pierce was beginning to let her in. The weeks of careful rhythm shattered with one phone call. Charlotte was in the penthouse study, finalizing color palettes for the Pierce Tower atrium, when Alexander's voice cut through the quiet. He stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, jaw rigid. The conversation was brief, his tone sharper than she had ever heard. When he ended the call, the silence that followed was heavier than any words. "What happened?" she asked cautiously. His gaze lingered on the skyline before shifting to her. "Davenport Capital pulled their funding. Effective immediately." Charlotte's stomach dropped. Even she understood the weight of that statement. Davenport Capital had been a cornerstone investor for one of Pierce Holdings' largest ventures, a project that promised thousands of jobs. Without their support, everything wobbled. "They gave a reason?" Alexander's eyes hardened. Reasons are convenient masks. This isn't about numbers. This is Sloane's way of making her point. The bitterness in his voice told her more than any explanation. Sloane Davenport hadn't simply withdrawn funding. She had struck at Alexander's foundation, and in 48 hours, he had to present stability to the board, or risk unraveling years of work. Charlotte forced herself to breathe evenly. What happens to the project? If I don't secure new capital by the end of the week, we cut it. 300 employees will lose their jobs. The weight of it pressed down on both of them. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the unspoken fury in his eyes. For once, Alexander Pierce looked less like the untouchable billionaire, and more like a man carrying the unbearable. Charlotte set her sketches aside and stood. What about Kensington Capital? He gave her a sharp look. Oliver Kensington? He hasn't partnered with anyone in a decade. But he respects integrity, she countered. My father worked with him years ago. He admired how Patrick handled negotiations even when it cost him profit. Kensington believes in loyalty. If you can show him this project isn't just about numbers, he might listen. Alexander studied her as though she had spoken a foreign language. You think I should gamble on a man who refuses to take calls from most of the Fortune 500? I think you should gamble on someone who values more than spreadsheets. Someone who might respect what you're building if you let him see it. For a long moment the room was silent. Then Alexander's mouth curved in something halfway between irritation and intrigue. You surprise me, Charlotte Hale. Her chin lifted, steady under his scrutiny. Let me try. Give me a chance to reach him. He considered her, his dark eyes searching hers for weakness. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Very well. You'll have one meeting. If Kensington slams the door, I'll clean up the pieces myself. Charlotte nodded, her pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew the stakes. If she failed, she would not only confirm his doubts but also watch hundreds of lives unravel. But if she succeeded, she could prove, to him and to herself, that she was more than a pawn in his contract. As Alexander returned to his desk, phone in hand, she felt a shift. For the first time, she wasn't just standing beside him as decoration. She was stepping into his world with a voice that mattered, and whether he admitted it or not, he needed her. The following afternoon, Charlotte walked into Kensington Capital's private offices with Alexander at her side. The building was old stone, its interior more library than corporate headquarters, the kind of space that declared tradition mattered more than flash. Oliver Kensington himself was waiting in a paneled study, a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes as sharp as the cufflinks on his sleeves. Pierce, he said without warmth, you're a persistent man. Alexander's voice was measured. I wouldn't have come if it wasn't worth your time. Kensington's gaze shifted to Charlotte. And this must be Patrick Hale's daughter. I remember your father. A rare man in business, honorable even when it cost him. Charlotte inclined her head. He always believed loyalty outlasts profit. Kensington's eyes softened, though only slightly. Then I'll hear you out. But understand, I don't invest in vanity projects. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Charlotte had expected. She found herself speaking more than Alexander, explaining the design for the Pierce Tower atrium, the way the project aimed to inspire rather than intimidate, how it could anchor not just a building but a community. She spoke of integrity, of legacy, of building something meant to last. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his gaze never left her. When the meeting ended, Kensington stood slowly. You've given me more to think about than I anticipated. I'll review the numbers. If they align with your words, you'll have my support. Charlotte exhaled, her knees weak with relief. Alexander shook Kensington's hand, his voice steady. That's all I ask. The drive back to the city was silent at first. Charlotte stared out at the blur of traffic, replaying every word she had spoken. Every moment Kensington's eyes had narrowed in consideration. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. You were extraordinary. She turned, startled. I only told him the truth. Most people bend truth into performance. You made it conviction. His gaze lingered on her, darker now, more intent. Kensington will back us because of you. The praise struck deeper than she expected, and for a moment Charlotte couldn't find her voice. The man who had bound her with a contract was now looking at her as though she had changed the outcome of his empire. When they reached the penthouse, the city spread glittering beyond the glass. Charlotte set her bag down, still trembling with adrenaline, and turned to him. "You didn't need me," she said softly, almost as if reminding herself. Alexander closed the distance between them. "You're wrong. I did." The air between them thickened. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, the simple touch sparking something that had been building since the moment she signed his contract. She should have stepped back. Instead, she stood still, her heart hammering as his lips found hers. The kiss was not careful. It was fierce, claiming, yet tempered with restraint, as if he was holding back more than he gave. Charlotte melted into it, the weight of weeks collapsing into one undeniable moment. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, his voice low. This wasn't part of the contract. Her breath caught. "I know." And yet, neither of them moved. The atrium redesign consumed Charlotte for weeks, and when the final presentation arrived, she stood in the echoing space of Pierce Tower with her boards, her renderings, and a nervous energy she hadn't felt since school. The cavernous marble floor reflected the afternoon light as Alexander walked beside her, his expression cool but attentive. "Show me," he said simply. Charlotte guided him through her vision. Glass panels reframed to soften the harsh lines, light redirected to create warmth rather than severity, seating arranged to encourage gathering instead of isolation. She spoke with her hands, passion woven into every detail. This was more than architecture, it was atmosphere, designed to transform not just a building but the way people felt the moment they stepped inside. When she finished, silence stretched. Alexander's gaze traveled slowly across the space, then back to her. His jaw tightened, but his eyes held something unguarded. "You've done more than design an atrium," he said finally. "You've given the building a soul." The words struck her deeply, not just for their rarity, but for the quiet reverence beneath them. For a heartbeat, she saw Alexander stripped of armor, a man who wanted more than wealth and control. But the moment fractured when a voice carried from across the marble. "Impressive, isn't it?" Arthur Pierce strode into the atrium, his presence filling the space with a gravity that even Alexander seemed to feel. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, Arthur exuded authority that had nothing to do with his tailored suit and everything to do with decades of power. "Father," Alexander said stiffly. Arthur's sharp eyes flicked to Charlotte. "And this must be the woman everyone is whispering about. The contract companion." His tone was laced with disdain. Charlotte's cheeks burned, but she met his gaze steadily. "I prefer Charlotte." Arthur chuckled, low and dismissive, before turning back to his son. "You're playing games while Davenport severs ties and competitors close in. This is no time for distractions. Merge with Davenport Capital and stabilize the company." Alexander's jaw clenched. "I won't hand over my legacy to Sloan Davenport. Not now, not ever." Arthur's expression hardened. "Legacy means nothing if it collapses under your pride." The air was tense, thick with unspoken history. Charlotte looked between them, sensing the weight of years in the sharp edge of their words. Alexander, always in control, stood rigid, his father's disapproval cutting deeper than he would admit. When Arthur left, his footsteps echoing against marble, Alexander turned back toward the atrium, but his gaze was distant. Charlotte stepped closer, her voice quiet. "You don't have to prove yourself to him. Not like this." His eyes snapped to hers, dark with conflict. "You think it's that simple? I think you've built something he can't see because he's too busy measuring you against his own reflection." For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then slowly the rigid line of his shoulders eased. "You see more than I want you to." Charlotte held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe that's what you need." The silence between them shifted, charged not with power or performance but with vulnerability. And in that fragile space, Charlotte realized Alexander Pierce was not only a man who demanded control, he was also a son still fighting for recognition, and a man who, for the first time, was letting her glimpse the wound he never showed. The confrontation with Arthur Pierce left a heaviness in the air that lingered for days. Alexander threw himself into meetings, his schedule tighter, his tone sharper, but Charlotte could see the cracks beneath. At night, when they returned from another charity dinner or investor gathering, his silence stretched longer than usual. It was as if he was holding back a storm he refused to let anyone witness. One evening, after an especially tense board meeting, Alexander entered the penthouse and went straight to the balcony, jacket discarded, tie pulled loose. Charlotte followed quietly, the city glittering far below them as the wind tugged at her hair. "You stood against your father today," she said softly. His jaw tightened, his gaze locked on the skyline. "He believes I'm nothing without his name, that I'll fail because I refuse to bend. And do you believe that?" He turned sharply, his eyes dark, burning. "I've built this company with my hands, every deal, every decision. But when he looks at me, he sees a boy still trying to prove himself." Charlotte stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve. "I don't see that boy. I see the man who stood by me when I had no one, who gave me the chance to fight for my father, who let me build something real in that tower. You don't need his approval, Alexander. You've already proved yourself." The storm in his eyes shifted, not vanishing but softening, as if her words had reached a place no one else had touched. Slowly, his hand lifted, resting against her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with unexpected tenderness. "You've changed everything," he murmured. "I didn't want this to happen. I wanted control. I wanted rules. And now?" His voice trailed, heavy with what he couldn't say. Charlotte's pulse raced, but she didn't step back. "Then stop fighting it." His lips met hers before she finished the sentence, and this time there was no restraint. The kiss was deep, consuming, a release of everything they had held back since the moment she signed his contract. She melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her heart pounding in rhythm with his. When they broke apart, breathless, Alexander searched her face. "This isn't about obligation anymore, not about rules. Do you understand?" "I do," she whispered. He turned, strode back into the penthouse, and picked up the folder that had bound them from the beginning. Without hesitation, he tore it in half, then again, the paper splitting with sharp finality. The pieces fluttered to the floor like broken chains. Charlotte's eyes widened. "Alexander, no more contracts," he said firmly. "If you stay, it's because you choose to, not because I bought your time." Her chest tightened, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She stepped toward him, her hand resting on his chest where his heartbeat thundered. "Then I'm not going anywhere." The look in his eyes was raw, stripped of the walls he had always carried. He pulled her close again, holding her as though letting go would undo everything, and in that embrace Charlotte knew the truth. Their story was no longer built on rules or arrangements. It was built on choice, and it was real. 6 months passed in a blur of boardroom victories and carefully orchestrated appearances. But to Charlotte, the real changes lived in quieter spaces. She saw them in the redesigned atrium of Pierce Tower, where sunlight spilled across glass panels that bore her signature vision. She saw them in Alexander's late-night pauses, when he let himself sit beside her with coffee instead of burying himself in reports. She saw them in the way he began to measure success not only by profit, but by the people behind the numbers. Davenport Capital's withdrawal, once a looming threat, became a footnote when Kensington Capital signed on and public opinion shifted. Investors who had doubted him suddenly called for seats at his table. Whispers that once doubted Charlotte as nothing more than decoration now carried respect for her designs and her quiet influence. Together, they had weathered the storm, and in doing so, they had built something stronger than either had expected. One evening, as the city lights glittered across the lake, Alexander led her out onto the penthouse balcony. The autumn air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. Charlotte wrapped her shawl tighter, smiling faintly. "You're restless tonight." He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before it softened. "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she teased gently, but the nervous flutter in her stomach betrayed her calm tone. Alexander's eyes were steady, darker than the night behind him. "When we began this, it was a transaction. A contract. Rules on paper. But you destroyed those rules, Charlotte. You showed me what it means to build something lasting, not only in business but in life." Her breath caught. "Alexander," he stepped closer, reaching into his jacket. For the first time since she had known him, his hand trembled slightly. When he withdrew it, a velvet box rested in his palm. Charlotte's heart surged as he opened it, revealing a diamond that caught the light of the city below. But it wasn't the stone that made her chest ache. It was the man holding it, the one who had once bound her freedom with ink, and now was offering her choice again, freely, without condition. "Charlotte Hale," he said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any boardroom decree. Will you marry me? Not because of contracts or appearances, not because it's expected, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Tears stung her eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the rawness in his tone. She thought of her father, now free and rebuilding his life, of the woman she had been the day she signed that contract, and of the woman she had become standing here. Yes, she whispered, her voice breaking, then stronger. Yes, Alexander. Relief flickered across his face, quickly replaced by something deeper. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand lingering against hers, grounding her in the moment. When he kissed her, it was different from every kiss before. Less fire, more promise. Far below, the city carried on in its endless rhythm, but on that balcony, Charlotte knew her life had been rewritten. She hadn't lost her freedom. She had chosen her future. The atrium of Pierce Tower gleamed with life on the evening of the Foundation Gala, a year to the day since Charlotte had first walked into Alexander Pierce's world. Light poured through the glass panels she had designed, casting warm reflections across marble floors where guests in elegant gowns and tuxedos mingled beneath suspended sculptures and strings of soft music. The space was no longer intimidating. It was welcoming, alive, a perfect symbol of everything that had changed. Charlotte stood near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the arm of her husband. The words still felt new, though their wedding months earlier had been small, private, and perfect. Tonight was not about them, but about the future they had built together. Reporters circled discreetly, whispering questions about the woman who had once been branded a contractual companion, but now carried the title of Charlotte Pierce, designer, philanthropist, and partner in every sense of the word. She carried their curiosity with quiet grace, smiling warmly at board members and donors, greeting each with the steady confidence she had earned. Alexander leaned close, his voice low enough for only her. You've outshone me again. She glanced at him, lips curving. Someone has to keep your ego balanced. He chuckled softly, the sound rare and reserved for her alone. His hand squeezed hers, grounding her in a way no spotlight ever could. When Arthur Pierce arrived, Charlotte felt the faint tightening of Alexander's arm. But tonight even his father could not rattle him. Arthur approached, studied the atrium with a critical eye, then finally gave a curt nod. It will last, he said, almost grudgingly, before moving on. Alexander exhaled slowly, and Charlotte smiled. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests filtered out, Charlotte lingered with Alexander at the edge of the atrium, the glow of the city beyond the glass. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. You changed everything, he murmured. So did you, she replied softly. She hesitated, then turned to face him fully. I was going to wait until tomorrow, but I can't. His brows lifted, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Charlotte's heart raced, but she smiled, unable to hold it back. We're going to have a baby. For a moment, Alexander was silent, as though the words needed time to settle. Then his hand moved instinctively to her stomach, his gaze locking onto hers with a depth she had never seen before. His composure cracked, not in weakness but in awe. A child, he said quietly, reverently. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. Our child. The man who had once bound her to him with rules and contracts now stood before her with nothing but love. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his voice rough. You've given me everything I never knew I needed. The city glittered beyond the glass, 1,000 lights echoing the future unfolding before them. Charlotte rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and knew with absolute certainty that the woman who had once signed away her freedom had instead discovered something far greater. Not ownership, not obligation, but love, chosen, unbreakable, and theirs.